Hello, everybody. Welcome back. Today, we're going to talk about personality assessment. This is going to be personality assessment is kind of a broad range of assessment types. Last week, we talked about clinical assessment, and we could kind of narrow that down to clinical conditions that live in the DSM or are related to ones that live in the DSM. And it's kind of a narrow thing. When we think about intelligence assessment, you can take a deep dive into that, but basically, you're talking about what's going on and up in the noodle. So, it's personality is to me anyway, it's a much broader topic, and the kinds of assessments that we do for personality is a just even I don't know, it's just there's a broad scope of all these different kinds of tools that we use. So we're going to cover a bunch of that. This tends to be one of the more interesting kinds of the more interesting to the widest audience because of the different sorts of tools that we use. So I guess that's enough preface before we jump in, start talking about it. So first of all, let's talk about what things they're used for, because if we're going to talk about what personality is, which we will get there, then we need to talk about all the different uses for personality tests too, and there's just a lot of them. So here's a couple up here, and I'm just going to kind of breeze through these, I think. Employment settings to aid in personnel selection. This is one specifically from my rehab background. When we talk about employment and vocational counseling and that kind of thing, we see personality assessments get used to determine what kind of person is the right fit for this certain kind of job. So if you think in your head of like, I don't know, think of a mechanic, you probably have some sort of stereotypical vision of what you think a mechanic either looks like or acts like, or the kind of, blue collar position that it is. Or if you think of like an accountant, you have a personality type in mind, something like that. So there's a place for this. There's also I'll tell you a story later that I think is kind of funny. There's also ways in which this can be used inappropriately. So I'll share more about that in a little bit too. In forensic settings, it can be used to aid in identification of problematic behavior patterns. So think of like your CSI shows. I don't really watch those, so I'm gonna not really know how to talk about them, but like CSI and Dexter and all those the crime shows where they have some psychologist go on the stand and say this is the kind of person who is evil, and they were insane at the time of their thing, so they're whatever, they just the kind of people who do bad things. We have an idea of what criminality looks like. Um, Psychopathic diagnosis. So I know last week we talked about clinical conditions, but the personality assessment sort of lumps in some of that psychopathic diagnosis stuff up here, which is a little bit confusing. Like, why didn't we talk about that last week? But you'll hear things like the MMPI talked about as a personality assessment, as if those traits, sometimes like personality disorders, something like that, they're so embedded in who we are that they fit in this category too. So it's a little confusing, but I'll show you kind of a little bit more about what that means in a bit too. We use them in clinical settings to evaluate overall growth or change in behavior. For those of you that are not really a big fan of like the heavily scienced tools that are developed with lots of statistics and fancy numbers and that kind of stuff, you might appreciate more of like the Myers-Briggs or the Enneagram, or I don't even know, like, I don't know, the values inventories, card sorts, things like that, that say something about who we are, what our character is, what's deep within us that tells us something about us individually. Those kind of things can be used in clinical settings too. When people say, well, I'm not here to like get over some symptoms. I'm here to learn how to handle life or navigate through difficult situations by self growth and self understanding, stuff like that. So they can be used there too. And I'm also adding to this list understanding underlying typological tendencies that lead to behavior. What I mean by that is, if you think about like the Myers-Briggs, the way Myers-Briggs often gets used, or at least the way that I was introduced to it, is you get a group of people, you take the assessment, and then you learn about the interactions between different kinds of people. Could be couples, could be employees at a work site, something like that. But if I understand, oh, you're an introvert, you're not just trying to ignore me, that's just how you spend your time because you recharge when you're alone. It doesn't mean that you don't like me. I am an extrovert, so I try to connect to you always, but I realize now that I'm overwhelming you and I need to ask questions a little differently or something. My behavior is led by the kind of type of person that I am. And so using these tools, it can help us understand interpersonal relationships as well as just what I am and how that's different from other people. And maybe as important as that I'm okay and other people are okay, we're just different, something like that. So also, career counseling, choosing a fitting career. I kind of mentioned that already, that certain kinds of people do certain kinds of jobs. We won't get into that very much in this class, but if you think of like the strong interest inventory and the self-directed search, and there's a whole bunch of them, like the Cooter and just a ton of different ones depending on where you are. The ASVAB, if you ever took that one when you were in high school, those ones, they will tell you something about the kind of work that would be a good fit for you. So nothing much more to say about those in here, since we're not really going to cover them in this class. But for clinical counseling, already mentioned that. School counseling to help determine difficulties in academics. Sometimes these can be used for that. Oftentimes it's more like intelligence assessments or behavioral assessments, stuff like that. But personality assessments can also be used to help students understand something about who they are and how they learn and that kind of thing too. So there's a role for that. Let's talk about it later in class, something if we need to. Employment counseling, there's not much more I want to say about that one. I used to talk, there you go, Camille. This one's for you. Get out of the way. Just kidding. Camille asked that I move my head out of the way when I'm talking about stuff that's directly behind it. And then the other day she goes something like, oh, I feel like you're doing it just for me and it's making it more difficult and because you always have to comment about it or something like that. So sorry for being in the way and commenting about it. And I'm happy to do it for anybody who has special requests that make their experience better. Let me know. It's not that hard for me to move my head out of the way. Just in case you're curious, the screen that you see behind me is actually over here on this monitor. I have another monitor here, another one here, so I can see myself down here. So if you see me looking around, it's because I see myself and I'm like, oh, you idiot, you're standing in the way again. But I actually don't see my head on the one that I'm reading from. So anyway, when I was in doing rehabilitation counseling and spent a lot more time on career related stuff, this employment counseling piece made a little bit more sense. But it's not just for what kind of work you do, but also what kind of work you're really effective at. So it's not just your interests and the kind of personality that you fit in, it's how effective will you likely be based on how you think about science or math or reading or different activities. So performance related kind of things too. And then neuropsychology, determining cognitive and behavioral effect of the brain of brain injury. We'll skip over that one too. That was a little bit more related to my rehab background too. But when people, I will say, I guess, when people have physical injuries, brain injuries, spinal cord injuries, cerebral palsy, MS, cancer, like all kinds of different medical diagnoses that we would lump into this consideration of disability. People often are challenging their core identity of who they are as people. Like, I was a farmer, then I had a spinal cord injury. Well, I can't drive a tractor anymore, and I can't, go out and milk the cows, and I can't do all these activities that I used to be. And that was what my grandfather did. That's what my father did, and now I can't do that. And that really challenges who I am as a man, as a woman, as a farmer, as an American, as a what people identify so strongly with certain kinds of occupations that doing some personality assessment can help a person recognize you're more than just your work. You have all these traits that also fit in other places too. So there actually is a lot more to be said for not just brain injuries, but other disabilities and how personality assessments can help a person reevaluate or identify for the first time, maybe, or for a second time in their life, what makes me me and what do my people love about me and what can I contribute back to them and those kind of questions too. So that's something that for this program, you guys will get more in the career class probably with Ola. So let's talk about what personality is before we talk about the different kinds of it. So just to give you just a basic definition, personality are stable and consistent traits that are expressed over a long period of time. Doesn't mean they're unchanging. In other words, I might have experiences in my life. I might grow to be a different kind of person than I used to be. But the idea is that if I take a personality assessment when I'm young, like a kid, a lot of those traits are going to continue on through most of life. Sometimes for those of us that are parents, or if your parents told you about you, they're like, oh, they were always an active kid and they just never stopped moving, and that hasn't ended into their adulthood, or they've always been kind of stubborn and hard-headed. Even when they were a kid, they were like that kind of stuff. It's that kind of stuff that we're really trying to capture here, that is long lasting and stable and doesn't change over the course of a life. Doesn't mean nothing changes or they can't change. It just means that they tend not to. And what the research has been over 100+ years has been, well, what are the parts that don't change? What kinds of people exist? If you think about Carl Jung and the archetypes, you have like the trickster and the hero and the I don't know, intellectual academic kind of type person, like the philosopher kinds or that kind of thing. There are different archetypes, and I don't really know what they all are, but if you were to look into those kinds of things, you'd find, well, there are certain types that across cultures tend to exist. So that's what we're talking about here. Um, if you feel, but there's also these controversies too. So here's one of the controversies, this quote right above my head. I'll read this for you and then we'll talk about it. If you view personality as a stable and unchanging collection of behaviors tied to only genetic predispositions, in other words, there has been a lot of interest in, well, if personality is stable, maybe we can figure out if it is transmitted through or expressed through genetic expression or something like that. And this idea that it's stable over the course of a lifetime, that's kind of been the popular conception. So if it's stable and unchanging and it's this collection of behaviors, then you're likely to see some clients as hopeless. In other words, clients come to us to make change. They come to us to say, I am this kind of person, but I could be a different kind of person. So the question is, are we changing personality type? Are we changing symptom expression through that personality type? Or which parts do we want to be different? Especially if we're talking about personality disorders. If those personality disorders like narcissism are just going to stay there and they're stuck because it's our genetics, then there's really no hope for a person to become different or better or something like that. So there's that way of thinking. On the other hand, if you see personality as a combination of genetics, sort of nature, and then you see it as environmental, like social learning, nurture, then you might see opportunities for clients to manage behaviors that have been ingrained or even changed long-standing behavior patterns. Okay, so this is when I would, we're not going to go here, but I'll introduce the idea of attachment and how we regulate emotions or affects as a child, and then as we continue to practice doing hard things and being able to handle hard situations, which is directly relates to how our nervous system activates and gets emotional and then calms so that we can handle things. How that happens is sort of a product of our internal capacities and probably some genetic dispositions as well, but also part of our environment and how attachment and our attachment to caregivers and that kind of thing, how it impacts our ability to express those genetic factors, that kind of stuff. So it's there's a lot more to talk about there, but nevertheless, what we want to do is we tend to now think of personality as the latter, something that can be changed through the process of, dare I say, artificial attachment experiences with a therapist that you can then recreate out in real life with loved people, or emotional bonds with people in your life and that kind of thing, which can then provide the opportunity to rehabilitate our personality into somebody that's not just a curmudgeon, grumpy person, but somebody who actually sees the joy in life, or somebody who can express gratitude, whereas they used to just get resentful and angry or something like that too. So that's sort of the foundation here. When we talk about personality, we talk about it as this sort of long-lasting thing. But then there are these parts that don't seem like they're quite as long lasting. Like we have these traits that can be expressed, sort of, we'll call them different dimensions of individual differences in tendencies to show consistent patterns of thoughts, feelings, and actions. In other words, they'll last for a while, but not quite as long as a lifetime, right? So like in a certain season of my life, I might think a certain way. When I was in college, I was a hippie and I just wanted to protest and change. This is not me actually, because I was not a hippie and I did not protest. But but I thought in sort of idealistic ways, which I think is probably normal for us to go to college and expand our thinking and say, oh, there's all these new ways of being. And then later on in life, we sometimes will go back to our families and say, "Oh, but I really appreciate the stability and consistency of a value system that isn't multicultural and I'm not considering what it's like to live in a Chinese environment. It's just my white Eurocentric American environment or something." So our mind expands, and then it also can we can have different traits expressed at different times in life. So anyway, that was a little bit of a tirade there for a second. We may also have periods of life where we express certain kind of feelings more than others. Just a little self disclosure here. When I was younger, I kind of learned that sharing feelings wasn't necessarily something I was going to be comfortable with. And it took me until my a little bit later in life to do some personal work and to go to my own therapy and learn a few things about me. And now I'm actually a pretty feeling person. My mom was a pretty feeling person. My dad, I think, is, but not quite as much in the same way. But now I'm like a crier and a person who, when I feel sad, I cry, and when I'm happy, I smile, and I reflect as genuinely as possible the emotions that I experience, because I found that uh, we learn to cope in ways that suppress or repress some of the feeling experiences that we have inside of us for all kinds of reasons. So that was a trait that I carried when I was younger. It's different than today. That's the point. And then we have states. They're more enduring, uh, and states are more temporary behavioral tendencies. So I'm going to skip down actually a little bit. And we're going to work a little bit backwards. Now that we're kind of building this idea that they're shorter and shorter term, let's go to the other side and say, I might have a feeling, and a feeling can vacillate from moment to moment. I might say, I'm super happy. I just found out that I won the lottery, and then someone told me that the ticket I bought was actually void, and I didn't win it because it was a fake or something. It's April 1st, and it doesn't count or whatever. And so I might be heartbroken right after I was really excited. So my feeling states can change really quickly. When we talk about moods tend to be something that lasts a little bit longer, and they're a little bit more stable. They may last for a couple hours or a couple days, or maybe, a week or 2 weeks or whatever that might be, but usually not longer than that. Something around that timeline seems to be about the way we talk about moods. Often it's more daily. Um, so then kind of meeting at the other side, states then are like something that might last for a couple months or a year or two, something like that. But traits are, more for this era of life, or this period of life, a life developmental stage or something like that. So you see how we have this sort of spectrum. It's kind of a hierarchy. I think you guys get it. Personality, what we're trying to really capture here is not what are the feelings, not what are the moods, not what are the states. We want to capture those things that are really foundational and fundamental to who we are as people. Okay. So maybe that was a long explanation, but hopefully that'll make sense as we dig into more of the stuff here. Okay. I'm going to see if I can get my transcription out of the way just so we can see that what's behind there. We'll hide the blue part because we're not doing clinical assessment. I think that's an error in my PowerPoint. Approaches to personality inventory development. Okay. So part of what makes personality inventories different is the way they're developed, right? Depending on the kind of use we're trying to get at here. So one of the ways is we can use this rational approach. When we're trying to think about what kinds of people exist in the world, we can use deductive logic to determine this. If I look around at the world and I say, well, I see there are these kind of people and they share these kind of traits, so it just sort of seems to me, and the people I talk to and the people around me, the way I think about this is I build this model of these different kinds of people. It's just using our brain to say, here are the kind of people that I see. It's kind of the old school way. It's the way we've always done it. When we think about different like religious or historically, before we really had these scientific approaches of categorizing and sort of manipulating how to categorize people and put them into these little packages or whatever. Before we did that, we just kind of looked around and say, what do we think about this? What's the best model? Who's the wisest person to explain the different kinds of people? And so we relied on religious context like Bibles and Qurans and that kind of thing to figure out what kind of people do exist out there. And then we started coming up with these theoretical models, and we would do things like build projective tests, for example. So Freud said, well, part of what makes us us is we have this conscious part of us, and then the preconscious, then a subconscious. And what happens is we experience these different things in life, and they get repressed down, and then we cope with them. And the defense mechanisms keep us from addressing all that hard, scary, dangerous stuff that's stuck in our subconscious. And so if we only had a tool to learn about what was down there, we'd get a much better sense of who we are as people if we could kind of filter out all the bad stuff, or at least even the bad stuff sort of makes us who we are, but we have to access it somehow. So we'll use things like free association was a popular one, but in terms of testing here, projective tests are often intended to reveal that unconscious, but we have to think about it. For example, the Rorschach is one example of that. Well, I'll show you some examples too. In order to do that, we have to feel, or we have to have a theoretical model to explain how our personality is created and developed. And then we use the tools to sort of dig in to this place that we theoretically think exists called the subconscious, but it's not tangible, it's not physical, it's metaphysical. And we have to have a theory to make a tool to then access it. Whether that's true, whether it exists or not, is up for debate, but that's another approach to this. You'll find tests like the Rorschach test that are developed based on that theory to do a very theory-specific kind of personality investigation, that kind of thing. And then there's criterion group approach. So, for example, you do a scientific experiment, you use an experimental design, and you can find things like population-specific characteristics, like you give men and women the same scale, and then find out how the men score similarly but different from women on certain elements which are unique to them. And what that means basically is then you can say, well, the personality of men looks like this, and the personality of women looks like this. Or you can take a big group of men, and you can, one of the popular terms right now, which I think is kind of stupid, and it's overly simplistic and dualistic, but it exists, is the alpha male versus the beta male, and sometimes the sigma male. Like there's these just different words that we use to categorize the different kinds of dudes. So it's a little silly, but we do this all the time in culture to try and explain people in different ways. But that's not very scientific. The scientific way would be, well, let's study these people. Let's put them into groups, and we'll do these experiments to find out, are these traits really real? Or is it just something that we make up to help us understand so we can make jokes on the internet or something? So there is an even more scientific way of finding out about people, and it's using a factor analysis. When we were going through the statistics stuff in our statistics unit, we didn't go over this, but I'll explain it really briefly now because now we can use it as an example or have an example. One of the tests that I showed you in class was the NEO. The NEO, actually now as I'm saying this, I'm second guessing myself a little bit, but I'm pretty sure this is true, so I might have to correct myself later. But the NEO was developed using a factor analysis. So, no, I'm sorry. It's not the NEO. It's the 16 PF, or the 16 personality factors. I'll show you that in a bit. The 16 personality factors were developed by using a factor analysis. So, well, how did you get 16 personality factors? In other words, each of us expresses all of these factors at some different way. I might be express one really strongly, but another one not so strongly, whereas you might express just the opposite or something, So we all have these 16 within us, but we express them in different ways. So why 16? How do we come up with that number? Well, if you were to do something like look at the language that we use and go to a dictionary, and you said, well, some people are happy and some people are glad. Well, happy and glad are kind of like the same thing, right? Like they're pretty close to describing a certain experience that people have. And they're not different enough to say that there's a significant difference in the kind of person who's happy and the kind of person who's glad. It's So let's just take all the happy words and the glad words and lump them together. And if a person says, I feel glad today, and another person says, I'm happy, we say, well, that person is kind of like the same kind of person. And then you take uh, angry and upset, and then you take frustrated and irritated, and you take all these different words, and essentially what you do is you throw them into a big bucket, a statistical bucket, and you put them through a filter system. You think of like maybe a bucket's not the best way, but if you think of you take a pocket full of change or like that lint filled can you have in your car or whatever, and you dump it into a coin machine, and the pennies go this way and the quarters go this way and the dimes and the nickels, and they all kind of filter out and separate. That's what we're doing. You take thousands and thousands of parts of our language to describe different people, and you sort it all out and you filter it out statistically, and you get 16 different factors that relate to different kinds of people that exist. So I won't explain the math. I'm not going to go into any of that. But it's a very mathematically heavy kind of way to determine the different kinds of people there are. So anyway, enough said about that. Another thing you can do is just combine some of these approaches. Use a little math, use a little theory, use your Brian. It's whatever. You get the idea. By the way, that somebody once said when I was watching a YouTube video and someone was talking some like first person shooter game or something, and he's like, "Oh, I shot the guy in the old Brian." Apparently, people were misspelling brain and spelling Brian, so it was this big joke, and I thought it was so funny. And now I use it, nobody knows what I'm talking about. But I think I chuckle to myself because I do dad jokes, and that's just who I am. So anyway, one of the tests that you should know that is related to clinical diagnosis and personality diagnosis specifically is the MMPI. The most specifically the Minnesota Multifacet Personality Inventory number 2. There's also the RF version. Did I have the other part hiding back here? Yeah, the MMPI 2 or the MMPI RF. They're basically just like the long version, the short version, kind of. And someone's going to yell at me if they know what this is all about, because they're going to be like, "That's not really what it is," and it's not. But that's okay. We don't need to care about it too much because we're not really going to learn how to conduct these or facilitate administering these. I will show you an example of what they look like, but we're not going to dig too far into them. But the point of the MMPI is really to determine psychopathology. So it's not uncommon for you to get somebody who, if they've been kind of in the system, quote unquote, they will have gotten an MMPI test done, and they might have a specific diagnosis that came out of that. This is more true of people who have been hospitalized or people who have been institutionalized in sort of like for criminal reasons, like in prisons, stuff like that. They're typically very complicated. The long MMPI 2 is 567 questions. They take like a couple hours to complete. I had to do one for myself, and I had to give another one to another person too. So they do take quite a long time. There is a ton of information, and if you want to look at some of the validity scales on page 314 in our book, you can kind of see a little bit deeper dive of how they work, and so maybe we'll talk about these in class a little bit because they are interesting to see how the really complicated assessments work. In this class, we've covered really simple, basic ones, and we've kind of increased in complexity a little bit. The CAPS 5 assessment that we didn't do, we subbed out the Columbia instead. That was a little more complicated, so we really haven't gotten into just more of like the more statistically complicated assessments because, frankly, not many of us are going to use them in our private practices. It's just sort of the nature of what happens in private practice. So we're not going there, but it would be helpful to see that. So I'm actually, how are we doing? 30 minutes? Let me just scan forward and see if I want to show you this now or I want to do it in class. Yeah, I'm going to skip over it for now, and I will, in class, I'll bring one of these examples and I'll show it to you there. So if you're not coming to class, you're not in class, you'll just miss out on this, but I can show you later if I need to. A few other scales that are more sort of clinically related is one is the Million. I have copies of that. I think I brought the manual into class and I can show you that one too. The MMPI focuses on clinical symptoms that can lead to a diagnosis. The Million is more specifically designed to make a diagnosis. In other words, if the MMPI is a personality inventory that is has more about, it's just more robust and it can say more about the person themselves and the kind of person they are. It's not just focus on symptomology. The million is more focused on that symptomology. Still kind of long, it's 195 questions. It's very robust in terms of like what kind of symptomological questions it will ask. In other words, if you take the whole DSM, take out all the symptoms from all the different conditions, the million will capture a lot more of what's in there than most of the tests that we've looked at. When we look at the cross-cutting measures last week and we say, well, this group of tests are sort of separated out into different conditions, from anxiety to depression to OCD to phobias to eating disorders, that kind of stuff. This one is sort of like all in one package, captures most of that stuff. And there are specific times where it might be helpful to have one test that everybody takes that can capture all these things, as opposed to a whole bunch of different ones. For most of us who are doing therapy, individual one-on-one or with couples or groups or something, that those cross-cutting measures are going to be more useful more often. But if you're working in an institution where you have to do assessments consistently, maybe regularly, and they have to be consistent across different people too, you might choose to use one test. Everybody uses it the same way. Every client gets it. It's usually like agency or institution kind of work that people do the million more often. The CPI, or the California Psychological Inventory, if the million and the MMPI are meant to discuss dysfunctions in people or pathologies or problems with people, the California is meant to assess personality dimensions in quote unquote normal people. It's not really for diagnosis. It captures more focus on like social and ethical and family kind of things, perhaps more like interpersonal kinds of dynamics too. It still takes a little while and it costs money to use it, but it can capture more than just pathologies. So um, I'm not going to say much more than that, because I used it when I was in school a few years ago, and now I'm like I'm not confident enough, and I haven't used it since. I'm not confident enough to talk about it specifically. Um, but I will bring an example in class, and I can show you what that looks like too. The Neo is one that I showed you in class. I didn't cover this with everybody, but when we talked about theoretical focused personality inventories, and I used Freud's conscious subconscious thing earlier, which then you use these projective tests, a whole nother way of thinking about this theory focused personality assessment is using the 5-factor model of personality. Very common. Several different assessments use it, if not many different assessments use this idea of 5-factor model. So this is a really popular way of conceptualizing different kinds of people. In other words, all of us are somewhat neurotic. That captures kind of how and why, or how much maybe. Extroversion or introversion, openness to experience. Could think of that as like maybe risk taking or adventurousness or something like that too, maybe. Agreeableness, could, one way to capture that is more of like passiveness or assertiveness. And then conscientiousness, those who care more about themselves versus those who care more about other people and kind of concern for the welfare of others, that kind of stuff. So these are 5 personality characteristics that are captured in the Neo and other assessments as well. And the 16 PF, I already kind of talked about that. On 321, there is a printout of the results of one of the 16 PFs. Maybe we'll talk about that in class when we get there too. We can kind of break that one down a little bit more. The Myers-Briggs. Most of us have heard about this, certainly. Most of us have probably taken this, if not a couple times in our lives. When I talked about Carl Jung and his archetypes earlier, this is based on Carl Jung's ideas. In other words, he was kind of one of the first people to talk about these sort of like categories of people, I think. But the idea is that everyone fits into these 4 categories, and you either are an extrovert or an introvert. You either are kind of a sensing or an intuitive person, and it's not like you're actually an either or. There's kind of a scale here, but we don't, the results of the scores don't really come out as a scale. It just says you're either an S or an I, an E or an I. or you're a thinker or a feeler, a judger or a sensor. I'm not going to go through and explain this because probably many of you have learned this in other places. I also think that probably many of you have taken this, but you haven't really taken a deep dive into understanding how it works. I'm not going to go into how it works and what all these things mean, just for the sake of time. And I want to show you kind of an introduction to different tools and let you dig into these more. But there is so much more information than just this on the internet, freely available because it's such a popular test that's been used so often. The, as I said earlier, the place that I've seen it used more often is like in the corporate world when people are trying to understand each other and work together better as groups and that kind of thing. That's how I took it the first like couple times, I think. So could be used with families, could be used with couples, it could be used. I'm trying to think of other applications. I'm sure there's so many of them, just not coming to me right now. But this is one of those things for those of you who are thinking, I want to do clinical work, but maybe 5 years down the line, you're like, okay, yeah, I'm good with the clinical work, but I want to diversify my income stream. So maybe let's do clinical work, but let's also run a group and then also maybe do some consulting work on the side. If you learn a system like this and you can market it to businesses around that have employees that they want to like have a team building exercise or something, these can be very positive focused, strengths based ways of doing that kind of activity. So something to consider if you really want to kind of dig into one of these. That's how this one gets used for stuff like that. The Enneagram. This one is controversial. I've mentioned it briefly in some classes, but part of the reason it's controversial is because we use these words like data driven and evidence based, and there's a huge emphasis on science and scientific foundation in many of the tools that we use. And there's good reason for that. We've talked about that in class. Um, this one does not have that foundation. This one it was developed, these two guys, Riso and Hudson, way up there at the top, they developed the Enneagram system, but the system of the Enneagram is based on old religious texts and anthropological and historical accounts of different kind and literature too. It brings information in from all these different fields of study to say if you look through the Bible and the Quran and the I don't know, like Buddhist and Hindu texts and Middle Eastern Sufi texts and like all that kind of stuff. If you look through that over the course of history, you tend to find these 9 different kinds of people, and that's basically just sort of anecdotal. But the reason it's said to be more powerful than just anecdotal, of like this is one person or these two people, Riso and Hudson. It's not just those two dudes. It's the experience that had been written down and passed down and sent on and reiterated and not just reiterated but reinforced that these sort of personalities exist. And so it's kind of like passed down through tradition, not discovered through science. So it's not looking forward and saying, how do we develop new information? It's how do we look back and understand the old? That's kind of a summary of how this development. It's also really not specifically a test. It's not like a test where you would say, well, I'm going to answer a bunch of questions and then it'll tell me if I'm a 5 or tell me if I'm an 8, something like that. There are those things and you can find them, but that's not really how the Enneagram is supposed to work. The way it's supposed to work is you take a test like that and you get an initial number. And oftentimes we take these tests like the Myers-Briggs and we're like, yeah, well, it's pretty close. It's a pretty close explanation of the kind of person I am, but it doesn't get it quite right. The intention of the Enneagram is to get that number and then read about it, learn about it, and say, I kind of fit here, I kind of fit there, I'm a little bit like this, I'm a little bit like that. And it's the process of self-discovery. And the more exploration you do, the more you find out that you're a 4 and that you also have a 3 wing with I forget the language now, but like there's all these different ways of sort of expression, and the Enneagram system is it's really interesting. The more you dig into it, the more interesting I think it gets, because if you look it up, in fact, I should just Google it real quick. I'll see if I can do it while I'm talking. Uh, but if you look it up, you'll see it's kind of on this circle thing, and I'm close. I'll find a link here. You'll see it's on this circle thing. Here we go. And see if I can pull it over to our screen here. Um, so for example, I am a number 7. That's my number, and there are certain times in which I have these wings, they call them. So I might act more like a number 8, or I might act more like a number 6. But there's also these arrows, and somehow there are these relationships. I don't really know this well enough to talk about these that well, but there are relationships between 7s and 1s too. And so the interpersonal dynamics between different types of people have functioned not just like this is the kind of personality I am, but this is how I relate to other people, particularly these other numbers. And depending on what's going on in my life, I might have um, my relationships might be expressed by certain interactions with different numbers. I'm butchering how this works exactly, but hopefully this gives you enough of an idea um, of kind of a little bit of like it's a system, it's complex, and the more you dig into it, from a lot of the people that I hear, they say the more I dig into it, the more value I get in terms of how I understand not only myself but other kinds of people. In other words, if I meet a person who's a number 5, here's how I might engage with them in a little bit of a different way. And this is probably particularly true of people that are close to us, like spouses and children and family members, in-laws, and that kind of stuff. So I'll let you guys dig into that. The one other thing I want to say though is the way that I have it listed up here. One of the things I like about the Enneagram system, which is different than a lot of other systems, and it's particularly helpful, I think, in this context of therapy and therapeutic counselor development, maybe even, is take me as a number 7. We'll use me as an example here. So I am an enthusiast. An enthusiast is the kind of person who you could characterize me as having like a chronic sense of FOMO, like I'm fear of missing out. I want to do every experience, and I'm enthusiastic, and I want to learn all the skills, and I want to meet all the people. And it makes me somebody who, when I'm healthy, I become accomplished because I have to get this certification, I have to write this paper, and I have to meet these kind of people and go to this kind of party. And all of a sudden, I have this network of people around me and all kinds of experiences and different skills that I can do, kind of jack of all trades sort of thing. Um, if you can imagine, I'm kind of extroverted. If you can't tell that already, you probably can't tell by this because it's not just by the energy that I show up on camera, but it is the way that I interact with people and the energy that I get from being around other people. I just love it. When I'm healthy, that's the kind of person I am. I can be accomplished because I want to be a part of so many different things. However, with all of these, there's a healthy side and then there's a not so healthy side that if we aren't careful and keep those in balance, if I'm not taking care of myself, if I'm not healthy, if I have weird relationships going on, I can come across as being fickle, excessive, like just I'm too much because if I want to know all the people at the party, I might just accidentally turn myself into everybody look at me, I'm the center of attention. And then people are like, ugh, gross. That's not really the kind of person that I want to be around, right? Um, or just flat out manic. I have to do all the things all at the same time, and I have to stay up late, and I have to spend all the money, and I've got to do all the things, which is obviously probably not a very healthy thing, right? So depending on your number, there's a way of doing it well, and there's a way of doing it not well. One of the last thing I'll add about this before we move on is one of the things I like to do when I give feedback to students, when I give feedback to clients, is I like to kind of model this a little bit, and I say, wow, you're the kind of person who loves deeply and you really care about these people that are around you. You have a big heart. And because that heart is so big, you're really feeling the loss of that breakup, or you're really feeling the loss of the way that this fight is impacting you, that you're having with this other person. In other words, the thing that makes you, your personality, is both wonderful in these situations and for these reasons, but it's also painful for these reasons. And holding both of the good and the bad, the sorrow and the joy at the same time helps us, I think, develop a little bit more of a complex understanding of who we are, coping with the good parts, appreciating and being grateful for the good parts of us, but also coping with the parts that are not, that are painful and difficult about us too. So anyway, that's just something that I've taken from this that I think people tends to respond to. I think because when people have done that for me, it says, I really feel seen and heard when they say, oh, are you this kind of person who does really well with this, but that same tendency doesn't do so well here? Another way I'll do this with you guys sometimes is like, I'll say, if you guys are all here, it's because you're super smart, you are accomplished, you are intelligent, you're capable, you made it into grad school, which is not something that everybody does, and there's a reason why you're here. However, that drive to achieve, that drive to self improve, that drive to be a better person for yourself also can sometimes tip the scale into being, I have to do all the things, I have to get it right, I have to be perfect, I have to accomplish so much stuff, and I can't let myself fail because I don't know what I would do with myself if I didn't make it, whatever make it means. But then you look around at all these other people who haven't done a ton of education and they aren't that smart and they don't, but they still love themselves to some degree, right? They can still cope with the reality of who they are. So the thing that makes you wonderful and accomplished and that brings us together is also the thing that we have to be cautious that we don't work it too hard because it could become your Achilles heel or your worst enemy. So it's that kind of way of thinking that I think lends itself to this kind of system. So whether that works for you, whether you like it or not, if you think this is stupid, that's fine. There are plenty of people who I've had in this class who I used to actually go into this a little bit more, and they're like, "Yeah, I don't buy this. I don't like it. I want the science." And I'm like, "All right, that's fine. You have options. No skin off my back." But there's my bias. Now you know it. Okay, let's talk about projective tests. So most of you are familiar with the Rorschach ink blot test, and I've already kind of given an explanation, a little bit of how they work. But the idea is that you show somebody an ink blot like this one right above me here, and you ask them to describe what it is. Uh, I'm hesitating because I just showed my father and mother-in-law uh, an SNL video from a few, I think it was just weeks or months ago or something, with the comedian Bill Burr, and this social worker or something is giving a Rorschach test to a group of people, and I won't say anything more than that to spoil it, but it's real funny. uh, Funny depending on your sense of humor, I should say. But the idea is that if one person looks at this and sees a butterfly, and another person says, "Oh, this looks like a murder crime scene with blood everywhere," it's supposed to say something about what's going on deep in your psyche. Um, their criticisms of these kinds of tests are that that's wildly subjective. How do you know what that's supposed to say? That relies on or depends on you as the administrator of the test make an interpretation about, if that person sees a crime scene, does that mean they're sick? Does that mean they have a dysfunction? What does that mean about who they are? There is a long history that I don't really know much about that has tried to sort of systematize. Well, if somebody says it looks like blood, it means this. And if they say it looks like a butterfly, it means this. And it's that comes from long experiences of using this test and using it in lots and lots of different situations, circumstances. So I don't have an opinion on whether they're useful or useless. What I can say is it seems like they're not as popular as they used to be. And there's question because the more scientific, data driven, evidence based we get, the less we look at these kind of things and think that has value here. It does rely on the administrator being the expert, which many of us sort of reduce that power dynamic. So we are equal collaborators in the therapeutic outcomes with our clients. So it just doesn't really fit with our contemporary way of understanding therapy. The one behind me, the thematic apperception test, I can show you a couple more of these, but the idea is very similar. The administrator will show a picture just like this and say, what do you see happening here? It's really fun to do this in class because some people will be like, oh, it looks like a mother who's cradling her son when he fell down the stairs. And other people are like, well, she's just about to snap his neck, which is really funny when people are like, she's killing him. And you're like, whoa, what does that say about you? And it's kind of a joke. And we laugh about it. But it's more story based instead of just having a picture that really doesn't look like much of anything except for what I think it looks like, which is a crime scene. I'm just kidding. You guys can say what you want about me. But these are more sort of story based. It's, you can ask people, what do you think happened right before this story or right before this scene? What's going to happen next? What do you think is going to come up next? And you can get some more interesting kind of like, I don't know, extended descriptions of what a person thinks is going on here. There are other kinds of projective tests, though, that are not out of fad or out of fashion quite as much. Um, some of these, remember when we talked about scale questions like 1 out of 10, tell me how much you like peanut butter? Or what is your mood? If you were to describe your mood, 1 being suicidal, 10 being the most joy or ecstasy you've ever felt in your entire life, where are you at? These are kind of the qualitative equivalent of that quantitative, uh, what's the right word, informal test or something. So uh, these kind of things can be helpful if you are running out of questions with clients or things to talk about if they don't really have a lot to say or to talk about. Um, Especially with kids, and especially I used some of these kinds of things in when I was doing like career evaluations and stuff like that. Here's just some examples. If you could be anything you wanted to be, what would you be? If you had 3 wishes, what would you wish for? Um, you can make up whatever questions you want. Doesn't these are just like examples of questions, but uh, I've sometimes used these when people are a little bit less expressive. In other words, they don't have a lot to say, or when we're like, okay, we want to dig deeper, but we don't really know how to do that. Let's see if we can find something that we can latch onto to that can give us a deeper understanding of you. I used to do these things when I worked at a summer camp where we'd be walking along on a hike and people be goofing around and playing and laughing and whatever. And sometimes there would be these kind of quiet moments where people would just sort of almost meditatively just walk 1 foot in front of the other. And we'd do these fun things, which I thought they were fun. We'd say, like, well, if you were a kind of car, what kind of car would you be? And some kid wants to be a Lamborghini, other kid wants to be a Chevy Silverado, and you'd be like, wow, why is that? What's the difference? And it's kind of just a fun activity to learn about ourselves and other people. Um, and every now and then you'd get somebody who says something that's just like, I don't know, either exceedingly weird or exceedingly interesting. So some of them are just little fun games, but other things can bring us to a new place as people together. Another fun one that was kind of like that, the car one isn't, I've never really had that much fun with it, but one that I like is if you were a tree, what part of a tree would you be? Roots, trunk, leaves, branches, uh, the water inside, the sap in the tree, the bark, like whatever it is, what part would you be and why? Um, and oftentimes you'll get answers like, I'd be the trunk because I'm feeling really stable at the moment, or I feel like the leaves because I'm just being chaotically blown all over the place in high winds in my life. And some things like that can be really helpful to sort of just draw out different kinds of people's experiences. The other thing I'll say about this too, really quickly, I want to speed up here because we're almost out of time. If you learn a little bit about motivational interviewing, or if you don't, you've likely heard of this miracle question. If you woke up tomorrow and your life were perfect, what would it look like? If you woke up tomorrow and all your problems were gone, what would your life look like? If you woke up tomorrow and you waved a magic wand, and there's lots of different ways of saying that miracle question, but the spirit is always that. What would things look like if your problems just went away? That's kind of a version of this. It's helping people try and re-envision what the circumstances of their life and their personality would be like. What would their experience be? And it can kind of be like a catalyst for getting them to sort of feel and think in new ways, that kind of thing. Another one that I don't have an example of now, but I can find one if we want to, is just sentence completion tasks. Did any of you, I think this was a thing in my childhood, but I don't see this as often anymore, but there were these books called Mad Libs, and it would tell a quick little story, just a couple sentences long, but it would leave blank like adjective and noun. And of course, as like a fourth grade boy, it's like put a noun in here, and I'd be like smelly socks or butt cheeks or something, and they'd say like, well, give an adjective, and I'd be like pooping, or not pooping, that's a verb, adjective, smelly, whatever. You guys get the idea. So it was a fun, sort of silly childhood activity that I got to play. And I still would totally do that. In fact, I should find some and play with my son because they're awesome. But you can also do this in sessions where you say, a kid and their mother went to the grocery store, and right before they walked in, blank. And you can ask clients to say, finish the story for me, make up the rest of the sentence. there are pre-made versions of this. You don't have to make them up. You can, but there are pre-made versions of it that can be useful in just sort of doing some exploration with people. So maybe we'll find one if we want to get to one later. Yeah, I got two more slides. Um, these projective drawings can be particularly helpful with children and adolescents. If you think of like if any of you are interested in like sand tray or different kinds of art therapy, I think these could kind of fall into that same category. But the idea here is one of them is the draw a person test where you say, okay, draw me a person. And people are always like, oh, I don't know how to draw, which is the same thing I say. But you get a person to start drawing and they draw all kinds of different things. You know, usually there's a lot of stick figures and stuff, but there is also a system how you can interpret these. I don't understand it. Someone tried to explain it to me once. I worked with a psychologist, and I was like, "All right, tell me what the heck is going on here." And she was she was like, she was actually talking about this one, the house tree person, but the idea is the same. Draw me a house, draw me a tree, and draw me a person. She's like, "Well, if the person is inside the house, that means this. If there's a chimney with smoke, it means this. If the person, like this picture, is sitting under a tree, that represents isolation. If they show a picture of mommy and daddy, but not daddy's girlfriend, what does that mean?" And like all that. So like there's a ways of interpreting it that are sort of objective, I guess. Probably more common, the things that I've seen is you sit down with someone, they start drawing things, and then you say, okay, that's probably good enough. Tell me why you drew this tree leaning over the top of that person. And that some people will say, oh, I don't know. And well, tell me what this person here is thinking. Why'd you draw them all black? What's going on in this house? Why are there not windows? And, like you just ask questions and sort of process through a person's decision making. Sometimes people do things automatically, not knowing that there was meaning tied to it. But when they work through a thing like this, they say, oh, I think I'm drawing something that means something that I didn't even know existed inside of me. And that's the idea of projection, of finding something in a subconscious that a person didn't normally have access to, that they were able to with your help of the drawing. So that's kind of the idea here. Lastly, in the textbook, one thing you'll notice about the MMPI and even to some degree like the Rorschach and some of these kind of things, a lot of them are very sort of negative focused. I wouldn't say that's true of the Myers-Briggs. Well, there's part of that when we talk about like the Neo and the Million. Some of those have focused on pathology and negative things, but positive psychology, or that what is it, a trend, a theory? It's not really, I don't know, it could be either one, I guess. But positive psychology is the idea that we're sort of strength based, and we want to learn about what makes us cope, what makes us good, what gives us self-esteem, what gives us self-concept. And so those are kind of fall into this category of personality as well. Quality of life inventory is another kind of just a basic example. If you guys are doing your final projects and you're like, I think it'd be interesting to know a person's quality of life. In fact, when I do disability evaluations of different kinds, I'll often use a quality of life inventory, because if somebody has acquired a disability and I'm doing a career evaluation, I not only want to know what job they worked before the injury and what job they can work after the injury and how much income discrepancy there is, but I also want to know about things that are a little bit less tangible, a little bit less economic, how much their relationships are strained or suffered. How much quality of life do they think they have about their value and their worth? And so that often leads to, it can lead to discussions of, you don't think your life has as much quality as it used to. Why is that? And just to give a very quick, brief overview, it's really common for people to have a disability and before it think, boy, if I had that disability, I'd rather die. It's a terrible thing that people say and people feel, but a lot of people do. And then people acquire disabilities and they're like, this feels like I've just died. I used to be this person and now I'm not anymore. And I don't know what to do. And it's just chaotic. And then they learn a little bit and they learn some new skills and they live life a little differently. And they say, well, actually, okay, life is worth living. And then they find out this has actually been a gift. There's this kind of progression of how you adjust and how you cope with disability. And I'm way oversimplifying it. But this idea that quality of life can improve and it can be measured throughout that process so that somebody can say, I want to get to the point where I can look at my amputation or my diagnosis and say, this taught me something about life and helped me reprioritize what's important or whatever the thing might be. But that's just some example of how that could be helpful. Cooper Smith's self-esteem inventory. I don't know what to say about that, but it was in the book, so go dig into it if you want to. And then the Piers Harris self-concept scale too. I don't know anything about that one, but also in the book, so we can dig into that one more, especially if you think you're going to be working with kids in a therapeutic context. Doing some play therapy is helpful, especially for you as a therapist to understand the child. That often relies a lot more on your personal interpretation of what's going on. So things like this can be helpful to learn how to administer, not only for your understanding of them, but how you can facilitate therapy, and then also how you can talk to parents and teachers and whoever else about what are they really feeling about themselves and how do they see themselves based in how can we adapt our feedback that we give them to help them feel better about who they are or think better about the kind of person they are, something like that. So anyway, that's it. I'm over time by 1 minute and 7 seconds. But thank you for being patient. I will see you guys in class. Bye bye.